Dr. Andrea L. Phillips is a family physician, Phillips Medical Services, PLLC, Jackson, Mississippi.
Hi, I know you guys it's getting late in the evening and you may be getting a little tired. So let me just start off asking a couple of questions first. How many of you in this room take some kind of medication on a regular basis? Any kind? How many of you have ever participated in a clinical trial? Oh, a few hands. That's great. I'm Andrea Phillips. I'm a family physician from Jackson, Mississippi, but that's about a little less than half of what I do. What I actually do and what I'm so passionate about talking about to you today is clinical trials. And I really feel blessed and fortunate to be among my people of faith. I mean, I feel like this is the work of the church, where we actually do things that impact people where they live, that really make a difference in their lives, because that's what Jesus did when he was here. So I sort of feel like also that a part of my work was done earlier, because just about every speaker who spoke today either mentioned clinical trials or they used slides that supported their talk that showed results of clinical trials. And that is so important to me because I want you all to understand what clinical trials are. Now I have to use my slides because, I'm the daughter of a Baptist preacher. And some people accuse me of trying to do that preaching thing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about African American enrollment in clinical trials and, again, emphasize why it's so important that we do it ourselves and that we support others in doing it, and we take a role in leading people in our community to participate in these trials. So hopefully at the end of this talk today, you'll know what a clinical trial is, why we should be concerned about clinical trial diversity, meaning including more African Americans, where we stand currently on diversity, what some of the barriers are to getting more of us to participate in these trials, and then discuss the solutions to some of these barriers. Now, a clinical trial, the simple definition, a clinical trial is a carefully designed, controlled, and regulated research study that tests new treatments for medical conditions. Now, the expanded definition, of course, is much more complex than this. There's tests for old medications that are already out to see if they work for different indications. For instance, one of the trials that I'm doing right now is testing a diabetes medication for its use in hypertension and obesity management. So that all comes under clinical trials. Also, the tests of any kind of durable medical equipment or medical devices that you may be using, because a clinical trial is the process by which all medications and medical devices obtain FDA approval for any indication. So if you're taking a medicine, it went through the clinical trials process. The issue we're discussing today is where there are many of us in those trials. These trials are closely supervised by qualified physicians called investigators, so I'm a physician investigator, and other research professionals. It's an entirely voluntary process. So when you sign up to participate in a trial, once you have given your consent because you've been informed about all the ins and outs of the trial, your participation is voluntary and it can be revoked. That consent can be revoked at any time. That gives you a little safety net if you feel uncomfortable. But the other thing is the clinical trial is the key to precision medicine. That personalized medicine that was mentioned before today, all of those new advances they're making in the treatments of cancer, we now know that breast cancer is not one disease. Diabetes is not one disease. There are genetic markers, biomarkers. All of this information has been gleaned from clinical trials. Again, were we included in significant enough numbers in those trials to make sure they work for us. We bear disproportionate disease burden in most of these areas, whether it's diabetes, hypertension, heart failure, obesity, all of these areas, we as an ethnicity bear more disease burden and have worse outcomes. So we need to make sure that we are at the table when treatments are being developed. So that's why we should be concerned. This is just a slide that confirms that it's projected by 2050 that 52% of the population in the US will be non-white. That's another reason. Okay, I just got my 10-minute sign. Why does it, oh, I'm pressing the wrong, okay. So where do we stand on clinical trials? There have been a couple of trials that I want to mention here. I was a family physician now. I'm not doing trials because I was trying to do this in medical school or residency or at some conference. I sort of stumbled over into this about 20 years ago because I'd been a family physician writing prescriptions every day for high blood pressure. Among us, 95% of my patients were African American. And I volunteered on my day off from my main job. I would volunteer at this small Christian clinic because they lost their physician. After I'd done this for about 6 months, I realized they had a research study going on there where they had lost their principal investigator. So of course, they said, would you do it? I said, sure. I didn't know what it was. Because I said that to say, even in medical school and residency, we really are not trained about the drug development process. So I volunteered to do it to help them out. Turns out that was the all-hat trial, and I don't know how to do the pointer. Oh, there it is, okay. Oh. Okay, I'm going to, oops. Okay, help me get back on that. I'm trying to get back to my, there we go. So sorry. This is the pointer, okay. The all-hat trial, which turned out to be the largest trial ever done anywhere, not just in this country, in the study of hypertension, okay. This had the most significant enrollment of minority patients, and of women, by the way. So I was involved in that trial, and we ended up enrolling 366 patients to follow them for 7 years, comparing several different commonly used antihypertensives. And the basis of the way we treat hypertension now in this country came a lot from that. The other trial I want to mention, so we had good representation in there, is the AHEF trial, this African American heart failure trial. This trial came about, this is to demonstrate to you that it is important that we're in the trials. There was a large heart failure trial done, combining 2 medications to treat heart failure. It didn't work, so they were just saying, we're not going to make this medicine. Someone thought to look at the small number of African Americans in this trial, though. And guess what? Those people got better. So they created another trial called the AHEF trial with that same medication combination, and it got FDA approval, so Bidil, the medication now indicated for treatment of congestive heart failure in African Americans, came out of that experience. I included this because I want you to know we need to be involved because the physiology is often different. The pharmacokinetics, the way our bodies process medications, is different in some areas, and with heart failure, it turned out to be very important. Right now, we know that the African American population in this country is, depending on what you look at, 12 to 13%, 12 to 14%. In 16, only 7% of clinical trials, and these were mostly cardiovascular trials, had African Americans in them. Only 7% of the total studied population were African American. This is pretty high, actually. It usually is about 5% or less. Now, what are some barriers to enrolling African American patients? This circle kind of, and I guess I need to put my glasses on so I can read it, kind of illustrates there are 5 major barriers that we discuss when we look at this issue, and I want to delineate those. This is what happens when a doctor is trying to make her own slides. That was entirely unintentional. Okay. But let's look at these barriers and try to address some of them. Okay, first of all, there's a lack of concrete knowledge about clinical research itself. I could stop the sentence right there. That exists among our population in general, but guess what? It also exists among healthcare professionals. That lack of knowledge about drug development, the whole process of bringing something from the lab all the way to the drugstore, is as foreign a process to most doctors and nurses as it is to the general population. I discovered this when I was presenting to my colleagues, trying to encourage them to become investigators like myself. But also, I think that the general African American population is not aware of how much, when we participate, like the trial I just gave you an example, how much we have benefited from participation. Also, the lack of African Americans in visible leadership roles in clinical studies. There are not many investigators who look like me. That's one of my goals now, is to recruit, educate, and help to train other African American investigators and coordinators. The coordinators are the ones who really work with the patients on a day-to-day basis. There are not many of us spread around the country now. When I go to investigator meetings now, I see more of us than I did 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still far too many. We are not represented adequately, and that affects how many patients we can enroll as well. There's a general distrust of research sites based on their historical relationships with local and broader African American communities. We'll touch on that a little bit too. There's a lack of endorsement, and this was mentioned earlier, by trusted grassroots leaders in the community. This goes back to what Pastor Prentice said. You get your pastor on board. You get those community leaders who are looked up to endorse this whole idea that we have to be mobilized to participate, so that those medicines you take every day that were mostly tried and studied in white males will be more relevant to our disease processes. Okay, and then the lack of time and energy to participate in research studies owing to the demands of general life. Those usually are dealt with once you enroll in a study. Most centers will go above and beyond to keep you engaged. Okay, let's touch on the distrust for a couple of, 1 minute. Saw another sign down here. I don't know, how many of you have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study? Okay, now, that was a real black eye on, pardon the pun, black eye on involving black patients in research. These men were enrolled in a study without their knowledge or consent, and they were denied treatment so that they could just be observed to see what the natural course of syphilis would be. You would think that this has a big impact today on the enrollment or the lack of enrollment of African American patients. I can tell you honestly, I've been doing research for 20 years in central Mississippi, and I probably, after enrolling thousands of patients in trials, have only run across 4 or 5 patients who really know about that. Now, they don't know directly, but they've just heard that research is one of those things you stay away from. Well, this group did a study on the impact of the Tuskegee syphilis study 3 decades after it was over to see if that was the reason people were not participating in trial. After looking at it, they interviewed people in 7 cities, over 70,000 people, 3 decades after the study was completed. And they determined, their conclusion was this did not play a big role in impacting African Americans' decisions to enroll in clinical trials. That's been my experience too. The thing that I hear most, and I don't hear it much anymore because I really discuss things with my patients, is I don't want to be a guinea pig. So this is my response. Those of us who are taking medicines every day for these diseases where these medicines have not been studied in us, guess what that makes us? Okay, enough said. Okay, so what are the solutions to these problems? The solutions are multiple and multifocal. We need to facilitate collaboration like this is here. Collaboration between investigator, scientific doctors like myself and community-based doctors who serve our populations. We need to leverage the leadership and the power of community and churches like this is today. And this just shows a few of the players, a few of the stakeholders in the community, and the Association of Black Cardiologists is there to help as well. The biggest finding in all the research that I've done personally and that I've reviewed is, brings us to this conclusion. If patients are asked by their own physicians, minority patients will participate in clinical trials. The problem there is their own physicians don't know much about clinical trials, so we have a lot of work to do. Minority physicians who have access to minority patients can be an important source of volunteers. This goes to when a patient approaches me about being in one of my trials and they want me to tell their physician about it, I will often call or send information and not get a response because the physician, my colleague that I'm contacting, actually doesn't know much about trials, and so that puts the onus on me to do more training with my colleagues. And again, minority investigators are poorly represented in clinical trials, so we have to do something about that. One of my proposed solutions is that all agencies that fund clinical research need to build a network of community-based investigators in minority communities. This includes the NIH, research foundations, pharmaceutical and medical device companies, academic medical centers. It needs to become a priority, and that needs to be at the policy level. Now, I'm always that practical person, so we're down to what can I do? I want you to have something that you can go away with today that you could do tomorrow or tonight. You can check out new clinical trials for yourself on clinicaltrials.gov. Every trial in this country that's registered with the FDA is included on clinicaltrials.gov. So if you live in New York or Arizona or Florida or Montana, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov and find the trials that are going on in your area that apply to your disease state. And you don't have to have some exotic disease or some major catastrophic illness. You know, right now I'm doing trials on diabetes to, like I said, to see if this medication helps with hypertension or obesity or delays progression of mild kidney disease to keep people out of the dialysis unit. If you want to see the result of what disease does to us, walk through a dialysis unit and tell me who you see. So this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this. You can ask your own personal physician or other clinician, if you see a nurse practitioner, ask about clinical trials for your medical problems. Do you have any trials for diabetes going on right now? Do you know if any are in the area? Your answer may be, I don't know, but what you'll do is spark that person to say, maybe this is something. You know, I've had 8 patients to ask me that today. Maybe this is something I need to look into. That's the way we have to begin. As far as your church goes, you can host a health fair. Most health ministries at churches have health fairs these days. Invite your local clinical investigators and coordinators from your area to set up a booth and screen patients or to give out information. Invite investigators to speak at your small group. The trial, which I enrolled 366 patients in, I did Sunday school classes, Bible studies, Wednesday night prayer meetings, just a 5 or 10 minute presentation, and people were happy to hear about it. And then finally, you can support a friend who is considering or showing interest in a trial, because they often need help to get through the consent process to feel comfortable doing it. Excuse me. Now, to summarize, the need for clinical trial diversity is great. I think that's been established today. Opportunities for participation are many, both on the subject level, that means the patient level, or for many of you who are health professionals, doctors, nurses, medical assistants. It's an opportunity for a professional career addition. The potential benefits for both individuals and for our community are tremendous. I didn't list how you can get free medications, tests that your insurance companies won't pay for. It's also an entryway for uninsured patients to get into the system. This has been a win-win-win for the past 20 years as a part of my practice, because it helps every way you look at it. And the time to do this is now. Thank you so much.